But fundamentally, if you keep close to the money, you'll stay fairly close to the trends.
And he said, Quentin, as much as you love engineering, the thing that matters in the world is cost of capital.
It's not so much a hard to abate sector, but it's a hard to deal with problem.
I'm going to say fascinated. It seems like you're fascinated with hydrogen.
Or either tells you that NASA don't know what they're doing, which I don't believe, or it shows how difficult the stuff is to handle. I personally believe, and have believed since about 2018, 1.5 degrees is not possible.
Hello everybody, Quentin here, and we're talking to you from Austin, Texas. Should probably explain, if you're looking at this video now and there's a big mural behind me, that's because we've had to last minute find a recording studio, and we found one in downtown East. The reason why we had to do this intro is because we've got Michael Liebreich on, and I mean, this is a guy who needs no introduction. He's been around for decades. He understands energy markets like nobody else. And he founded New Energy Finance that got sold to Bloomberg. And since then has had a massive impact on all parts of the energy transition. So the reason why I love this conversation is two reasons really. The first one is Michael is somebody who completely knows his stuff and is not scared to speak up for what he believes in. And you can tell in our conversation that he has got passion beyond anything else. And the second reason why the conversation is great is he's just an entertaining guy to talk to. He's got stories, he's done some fantastic things, and I know you're going to love this. So as ever, please do hit like, subscribe, hit all the good buttons. It means the world to us, and let us know what you think. All right, hope you enjoy it.
Hello, Michael. Thank you very much for joining us on the podcast. And in our London office, you've come a good few miles to get here. Thanks for joining us.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
This is one of the most anticipated episodes we've ever had. The Modo team have been excited to do this too. Today, we're going to talk about lots of different things about the energy transition. We're going to zoom in on some of the key focus areas you've had in the last few years. Your work has got a lot of attention. But before we get started, Michael, who are you and what have you done to get here on this prestigious Modo podcast?
So how long is the podcast? Because, sadly, I've jumped around. I've done lots of things, actually, happily. So Michael Liebreich, I now run really two businesses. One is called Liebreich Associates, which is me, my advisory, my sort of public speaking and writing. And the other is something called Ecopragma Capital, where I'm co-managing partner, which is a boutique advisory business, potentially also a fund manager at some point, which I run with Henry Lawson and Henrietta Jowett, who, two partners, and we're building a business there.
And before this, you've done a lot of stuff in energy. In fact, if anybody has seen the global energy transition from zero to where we are now, it's you and your team. So can you just talk us through briefly where you started out your career and where you got to? And I know there's some skis involved somewhere.
Yes, the skiing always comes up. But in terms of the energy, so by background, I studied what I didn't know at the time, but I know now, was energy engineering at Cambridge. So I did, in my final year, it was mechanics, fluids, thermodynamics, and nuclear. But it was called a Bachelor of Arts in Engineering because that was sort of, all very Cambridge.
Very Cambridge, yes.
Yeah, very Cambridge. But it was basically, energy engineering. I then went off and did consulting. Actually, what's been great in the last year, I was made an honorary fellow of the Energy Institute. And, I always had this
Congratulations.
well, thank you. I felt like there was unfinished business because after Cambridge, I was part of the brain drain that went into business. And so I never felt like I could say I'm an engineer. But of course now I'm a proper member of an institute, honorary fellow, and that's
You've got
great.
a hard hat and some boots as well, I hope.
So, I got all of that. I was on the board of transport for London, so I actually got a TfL hard hat and TfL boots. So I'm not allowed to wear them.
When was that, in the Boris days?
No, it was, yes. I was put on, it was Boris's second term, and then I stayed on. I managed to persuade Sadiq Khan to keep me on, to work actually on road safety, and then I became too vocal and I got rotated off. But after Cambridge, there was some skiing involved, a lot of skiing. One of the reasons I didn't go into engineering, I went into consulting, was that I was getting very, very involved in ski competitions, freestyle skiing, moguls, and it was kind of a bit of fun to start with. I wanted to get an England jacket, and then I went through the England thing. And I went onto the British team, and suddenly my discipline, freestyle moguls, became an Olympic sport. And so that meant I couldn't have a kind of proper career because I wanted to go off to the Olympics, which I did. So I went to Harvard Business School, and then I did a lot of skiing and consulting, and came back to energy after in about it was 2000 and actually it took all the way through till 2004 when I founded what's now Bloomberg NEF. So it was New Energy Finance. But the funny story, when you said that I was in at the beginning of the kind of clean energy revolution, right? When I was at Cambridge, first of all, we were talking about something called Salter's Duck, which was a wave-powered machine, which I thought was ridiculous at the time, and still do now. But also, one of the case studies that we dived into was La Rance, which was a tidal barrage in France. It's actually one of the very few tidal barrages, very expensive. But I remember working on
making
that.
electricity from tides.
Exactly, electricity from tide. So, in an alternative universe, I could have actually gotten involved through the fluid dynamics and aeronautics into the early designs of wind turbines, but I didn't. I went off and skied and was a management consultant. And then I did loads of stuff on the internet, which of course is all about digitization, and so it's incredibly valuable for what I'm doing, what I've done since. And so I have seen the very early stages of clean energy, and then obviously right the way through to now.
Let's talk about new energy finance for a second. So Bloomberg New Energy Finance, as it now is, wasn't that originally? It was your company called New Energy Finance, or NEF. And you built that over a few years. What was the vision for that, and then what happened?
So the vision for it really was that I was unemployed and unemployable after the dot-com boom bust. Because having been a consultant, what I did is I actually left. I joined Associated Press, did loads of stuff in media,
Nice.
Got obsessed with the internet, got very involved during the dot-com bubble years of around 2000, and ended up high and dry, having got very little money out, and unemployed and unemployable. But I was sort of decompressing from that experience, also traveling a lot and reading a lot, and it became sort of everything I did seemed to have an energy angle, everything I was interested in. And what was missing for me was an information provider. I'd come out of telecoms and internet, software and hardware, but also logistics before that I'd been working on. And suddenly I was in this, I was interested in this stuff, and there were no good sources of information. Nobody could tell me, how much money was flowing into, biofuels versus wind versus solar, venture capital versus infrastructure. And so I started to pull together information for my own thinking and wasn't sure what to do with it. This is 2003. And by 2004, it was clear that what was really needed was a really professional, sort of what I would call investment grade information. Mm-hmm. And there was a publication in the internet years called New Media Finance. And I thought, well, I'll just call it New Energy Finance because I've got no imagination. And I wanted to send the message that this was not about the technology, this was not about the environment, this was not about policy, this was about actually rolling the stuff out, which requires finance, which requires money. And I wanted to make sure that was very clear. And
it's still like that. It's still true to form, isn't it? That one of the things that Bloomberg NEF is so good at is that it's almost a macro level. It's the big picture stuff, where the money flows and which countries.
We sold it to Bloomberg. I mean, it was which was a brilliant acquirer, because we were coming at it from this very hard nosed kind of the numbers have to add up, and essentially, if the money flows, we will live in a world of clean energy, and if the money doesn't flow, we won't.
Exactly.
So the actual sort of acid test of whether we're transitioning or not is. Well, the leading indicator and the thing that you can't fool is the money flows. So we built very much around that. And of course you have to be expert on policy and learning curves, and you have to keep aware about any technologies that can wrong foot you, like fracking or Elon Musk's latest brainwave or whatever. But fundamentally, if you keep close to the money, you'll stay fairly close to the trends. And then of course Bloomberg was the perfect acquirer, and partly because they have a similar philosophy of how you create transparency through financial analysis, but also they had so many of the data sets that we were increasingly needing. So when I was by about 2007, 8, 9, what did debt cost? What would debt cost if you're building a wind farm in Germany or in South Africa, that's the absolutely key question.
Yeah.
And so, of course, what's the best source of information on, not just debt, but also commodities and increasingly all the other, the sort of all the news coverage that they have. So it was actually a really good fit.
I remember one of my old bosses in my old company. He was an engineer and I'm an engineer originally. And he said, Quentin, as much as you love engineering, the thing that matters in the world is cost of capital. And he said, you are going to learn it now or in your 30s or your 40s or your 50s, but that's what matters.
Yeah, I would say it's not just cost of capital. I mean, it's because as an entrepreneur, it's actually balance sheet. Particularly because obviously, you at the moment with Modo, you're in a situation where, the cost of capital is sort of infinitely cheap or cheap enough, let's put it that way. And by the way, I don't know if you've revealed this in your intro, but I am an investor, so some of that capital is mine. But yeah, it is balance sheet. It is the money side of things. And actually, that was one of the reasons why, going back to when I was at Cambridge, I didn't really kind of regret leaving engineering and going off and doing other things because I had this incredible academic training. Vast differential equations, and it was all fabulously kind of challenging and interesting. And carbon fiber was the new thing, and the Rolls-Royce aero engines were the new thing. It was all great, but during my entire time at Cambridge, we did precisely one exercise on the cost of anything we designed. One, and the denominator there, the metric wasn't even pounds; it was units. We had to design a structure that could withhold a certain weight, a certain distance away from a wall, and you had to build the thing. And they counted how many pop rivets you used, and whoever could build it with fewer pop rivets, that was the winner, and that was it. Other than that, we did no costings whatsoever. So engineering at that point, to me, that's kind of absurd, ridiculous thinking about it in retrospect. But I was well aware that you couldn't be a proper engineer if you couldn't cost what you're doing.
Absolutely. Let's talk about Liebreich Associates and what you've been working on recently. You've got a lot of attention in the news and in The Economist, in the Financial Times, in big publications about your work on hydrogen and your take on what's happening. I'm going to ask you a very difficult question now because it's very broad. But what's going on in hydrogen at the moment? What's the big picture thing that's happening? And then we're going to zoom in on it.
So let me just back up for a second, just because my role in all this, you've dived straight into hydrogen, but really since I started New Energy Finance, I've had this kind of role as a commentator. Initially I was doing it because it sort of publicized the business, the core business of New Energy Finance. You obviously enjoy your podcast, but you're also doing it because it's good for Modo to have an authoritative, voice and to be in the conversation. So I started exactly the same way. And, initially I was not talking about hydrogen. Initially I'd have been talking about, in fact, I spent between 2004 and about 2015 talking about when would renewable energy be grid competitive? Because the big criticism was, well, it's not competitive. And when will it be grid competitive? And the answer is 2015 is exactly the year. And nobody's ever asked me that question since. But they're asking other questions. And I have this role where, because I see so many different innovations, and I bring together some engineering, some finance, some policy, some almost anthropology. So that's a role I've assumed.
Can I ask a question on that?
Yes, sure.
When people were saying, what year is it going to become cost competitive? Was there a big group of people who were saying it would never happen? What was it like in the late noughties when you were saying, you had your models saying, wind and solar is going to come down, the cost curve thing is miraculous. And I imagine there was a lot of pushback. What did that feel like?
There's lots of answers to that question because there's lots of people in different positions, different perspectives. So there were initially a lot of people who just thought that it was kind of, they called it alternative energy, and they just couldn't see how this stuff could ever be important, right? And they couldn't see that, for instance, that it would grow, that it would scale, and that it will destroy the price formation mechanisms within the power markets, right? As soon as you've got lots of power being dumped on the market when it's windy and sunny with zero marginal cost, you just have a system that doesn't, that is works fine as long as there's a fuel cost, right? You've got nuclear power, which has very low fuel cost, very high capital cost, but you want it running 24/7. So that's not a problem if that dispatches first, because that's what you want, right? And then you have a system that's kind of works nicely between, what they used to call base load, right, which would be coal or CCGT gas. You want that kind of running next, and then the peaks you cover, and they're more expensive. And so everything kind of works on a marginal cost price, when the price basically matches marginal costs. It all falls apart. And so there were a lot of people who were just like, why are you even talking about this stuff? This is, so I went to
What sort of year are we talking?
California, 2007.
2007.
I went there and I said, your daytime electricity price is going to go to zero. And these people laughed. They laughed, right? Now it's called the duck curve, right?
Or the super duck is the new trendy word.
I haven't heard the super duck, but I'm assuming it's when the price really gets squirrely.
When you're more right.
Even more, right? And it was, to me, it was blindingly obvious that you've got sun in California, and when it's really sunny, they'll build too much or more than needed, and the price will go to zero. But what they were looking at was there's sun in California, and therefore the air conditioning load is highest at midday, and so the prices are at the highest at midday, and this guy coming over from London is an idiot, right? But they were well-meaning. But there's a whole other group that were not well-meaning, that are actually, and particularly as it started to be clear that this stuff really was scaling, there's a whole other group who actually all they're trying to do is use whatever weaponry is available, levelized cost, and when that no longer works, it's cost of integration, and when that doesn't work, it's just regulatory capture or throwing rocks, of whatever it is. And so there's a bad faith element to the pushback as well. And I would say there's also, there are other groups. So, for instance, around 2012, I was involved with a World Economic Forum. It was originally called the Alternative Energy Something Council. I'm blanking on the name, but it was basically a little group, a sort of think tanky group on. They called it alternative. I refused to operate. I said, look, we're going to call it clean energy, and that's that, or clean or sustainable, but not alternative, because already you could see the investment volumes, soaring, and the Agenda Council. That was what it's called. The World Economic Forum Agenda Council on sustainable energy, and what we did is we went off to Dubai, all met together, and were supposed to produce a sort of state-of-the-art position paper. But we also had access to these other agenda councils, and I thought, okay, we're in this great big sort of sports hall or conference center, divided up by into these little cells, about 70 or 80 of them. And I went off to find the central bankers, and I went off to find the asset owners and the asset managers and the financial risk people. They all had their own little councils. And I asked them, why are we not seeing more investment in clean? And essentially what they said was, it's too risky. It's too risky. We would love to invest, the asset owners, the asset managers, we would love to invest, but it's just too risky. Well, guess what happened? All of the investments that they put into fossil since then have basically done vastly worse than the investments that have been put into clean. So it turned out fossil was more risky.
What do they mean by risk? Was it technology risk, or was it?
No, it was their perception of risk. Right? They couldn't imagine how they saw these technologies as being essentially supported by subsidies. And therefore, the subsidies might go away. And that's what we saw in Spain, for instance, retroactive changes to subsidies, and that wipes out the sector for 10 years. But what they couldn't see is either that climate change is real and therefore provides physical risk and transition risk, regulatory risk, the Mark Carney 3 risk buckets. They couldn't see how that applied to a portfolio of coal assets, right? In 2015, all the coal companies in the US essentially went bankrupt. But they couldn't see that coming because they couldn't understand either the economics of not just renewables, but that was also shale gas, and funnily enough, energy efficiency.
Yes.
Just energy productivity. They couldn't see the risks. They were looking at a sort of subset of risk. So they pulled out a sheet of paper and said, what's the risk to Peabody Energy or Peabody Coal? And it's hard to write things down. They couldn't think of any. And of course, whereas over on this unknown little nascent area of the energy sector, all they could see was risk. But they were wrong. They were just magnificently wrong.
It sounds a bit like what happened in battery energy storage in the 2015, 16, 17, 18 era. And banks are saying we can't lend against this, and the cost of capital was too high. And now we've got the boom. And it just takes time, doesn't it? But I guess folks who can't see what's coming do get left behind in some situations.
We should come back to the hydrogen question.
Well, yes, yeah. So
that you posed.
So how did you end up looking at hydrogen? How do you know? I'm going to say fascinated. It seems like you're fascinated with hydrogen because you've done so much work on it. How did you end up in that position? And what's the big picture thing that's happening to, if you're explaining to us as Modo folks who are in the electricity industry but not necessarily in the hydrogen world?
So the funny thing is, when I was thinking of starting a business in clean energy, so 2003, there was this thing called the hydrogen economy. Everybody was obsessed with hydrogen. Every 20 years, people have become obsessed with hydrogen, or there's been this kind of boom in attention, let's call it. And there was one going on back in 2000. Ballard Power, fuel cell company in Canada, was worth umpty whatever on the stock markets and ultimately lost 97, 99% of its value and so on. And I looked at it then, and I decided that it was too far from commercialization. It would just simply take too long. I'd come out of the boom bust, and I couldn't afford to hitch my wagon to another train that wasn't going anywhere, fast.
Me personally.
Yes. So I actually was talking about becoming the CEO of a fuel cell company back then, and luckily the negotiations fell apart, and I founded New Energy Finance. So I've been interested in hydrogen and its role in clean energy, since 2003, and obviously drawing on the, even back to kind of high school physics, all the same stuff. It's very interesting. That bubble back in 2000, 2003 of hydrogen interest kind of fell away. And by the way, for those who didn't live through it, it was very reminiscent of what's going on now. So there was, for instance, a fuel cell vehicle, target in Japan of, millions of vehicles, and, George W. Bush was talking about hydrogen.
Schwarzenegger was involved somewhere.
Schwarzenegger had, I think, a hydrogen-powered Hummer.
Yeah.
And so there was, the hydrogen highways were being, everybody was, they were going to be hydrogen fuel, and it went away. And so when it started to, that in a way, maybe that kind of inoculated me, having lived through that and sort of, had high hopes for it, and then thought, nah, not yet, or maybe not. So what I've seen coming back into the debate, as the hydrogen kind of came back into it, there are these, it started, I suppose, about 4 or 5 years ago. There were these things called hard to abate sectors. And that's a sort of a natural outgrowth of the progress of wind, solar, batteries, EVs, because when you see those accelerating and those become, it starts to become easy to say, or much easier to say, well, that's clearly going to scale. But then you look at it and you say, well, that's not enough of the economy, right? We're not going to solve climate change just by doing wind, solar, and batteries and EVs.
What are these hard to abate sectors?
So you've got things like aviation, you've got things like shipping, you've got things like cement, you've got things like steel, and a lot of agricultural tractors. How do you do that? If you want to run your combine harvester 20 hours a day for during harvest, how do you do that? These are difficult questions, real questions. And of course, if you've got a lot of wind and solar, then the question is, well, what do you do when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine? So it's not so much a hard to abate sector, but it's a hard to deal with problem, which is long duration I frame it as resilience rather than long duration storage, which I think we'll probably come back to.
Yep.
And suddenly we start to see hydrogen popping up as the cure-all, the magic bean, the silver bullet, whatever you want to call it. And I'm just too much of an engineer, and I've got too much inoculation from watching, at least one major wave of excitement just run into the sand, not to dive in. And of course, people start asking me, I also have clients, advisory clients saying, oh, how should we play the hydrogen wave? We're being offered this, we're being offered that. What do you think, Michael? And the problem, there's a very interesting phenomenon going on, which is, I don't know quite, well, I should name it. I should call it the Liebreich confidence and fear curve or something. If you talk to people about nuclear power, the more people know about the engineering of nuclear power stations and the nature of nuclear radiation and so on, the less scared they are.
Yes.
Right? And the people who are really terrified of nuclear tend to be people who really don't know anything about it, have not really looked into it, and then they believe all sorts of stuff about, how many people died from this and how many people died and all the rest of it. But the closer you are to knowledge, the less fear you feel. So hydrogen has a kind of reverse confidence curve where the more you know about hydrogen, handling it, particularly liquid hydrogen, but not only, the more you actually are skeptical about its use broadly in the economy. And the people who are really in favor of hydrogen tend to be politicians and economists and marketing people and lobbyists. And they're enormously excited, but they don't actually know what it's like to use hydrogen in a chemical process and have to, secure a lab where you've got a potential hydrogen leak or whatever.
Well, this is what I wanted to ask you, because there's a lot, I don't know how many, maybe hundreds of thousands of people working on hydrogen stuff right now globally. And a lot of these are incredibly, well-read, smart, switched on, loads of experienced people. But then a lot of, for example, some of your work has shown that some of the numbers don't add up for certain things, right? For example, aviation is going to be tricky, stuff at the bottom of the hydrogen ladder. And we'll come to the hydrogen ladder in a second. So what's happening here? Is it, the cynic in me is thinking it's money that's driving this, right? It's lobbying, or is that too simple? Is there something more complicated happening?
I think there's a lot of things going on. Certainly, once you have a job as a hydrogen lobbyist, it's extremely difficult to turn around and say, it has no role to play in, light vehicles at all, and its role in heating is going to be minuscule. And to be kind of, so the hydrogen ladder, we should just say, the hydrogen ladder is stuff at the top. We have to use clean hydrogen for, because otherwise we'll use dirty hydrogen, which is driving 2.3% of global CO2 emissions. Stuff at the bottom is extremely unlikely to work with hydrogen because it just makes no sense at all, like a hydrogen taxi or a hydrogen scooter.
When you say makes no sense, do you mean as in it won't be economical or something else? So
I've talked to the curve of people who are close to hydrogen thinking it's inappropriate. A lot of that is to do with safety, but really these are actually economic questions because you can make hydrogen safe. It's just the things you have to do in order to do that become very, very expensive. And also, there's just the inherent inefficiency or the inherent capital cost as well. If you've got a heat pump, it's a fantastic thing. By the way, a heat pump, if we're looking for silver bullets, the heat pump has to be the closest thing we've got to a silver bullet in climate action, to be honest.
Yep.
Because what you do is you generate a small amount of work, in physics terms, work, i.e. electricity, and then you put it into this magical machine which multiplies it by 3, 4, 5, 6 and turns it into heat, right? And the alternative, if you compare that to hydrogen, where you take that work, that electricity, and you then discard some of it because you make hydrogen, and then you have to compress it and pump it and move it around and do all sorts of stuff to keep it from leaking. And then you burn it in a boiler where some percent of it, maybe 15% of it goes up the chimney, whatever. So you're looking at one solution that is, let's call it 60% efficient, and one that multiplies by 3, 4, 5, 6, and frankly even more with modern heat pumps. But it's not just the efficiency; it's also the capital cost, because we get these solutions talked about like ammonia. Oh well, we can't ship hydrogen, so we'll ship ammonia. It's like, yes.
That's the new thing, isn't it?
So you've got capital cost of electrolysis, capital cost of then taking the hydrogen and doing the Haber-Bosch process to produce ammonia. Then you've got to compress the ammonia and liquefy it. So there's more capital cost. Then you need some ships, capital cost. Then you need to gasify it, capital cost. And so it's not just that you've got 20% end-to-end efficiency, it's that you've got massive chunks of equipment at every stage, versus just take the electricity, stick it in a heat pump. Or with cars or electric vehicles, you can take the same, in the UK, most of our clean electricity will come from the North Sea. So you've got, North Sea wind, and you can either put that in your bus and drive your bus, and that's going to be about, 80% efficient with regenerative braking, a bit of grid loss, a bit of loss in the vehicle. Or you can turn it into hydrogen and then do all that pumping and compressing and whatever, and then put it into your bus where it will only be about 30% efficient, maybe between the bus and the wheel, just between the fueling station and the wheel is about, it's probably going to be 30, I don't know, maybe it'll be 40% if it's a nice fuel cell. But you know, if you look at how many miles you can drive from, you know, each turn of a big offshore wind turbine, it's 2.5 times as far if you use an electric vehicle. And you don't have all of that capital cost sitting in between.
Infrastructure you need. So
to me, it seems pretty much a no-brainer, you know, that we're going to go to electric transportation, electric heating. Then back to your question about why isn't that obvious to people working in the sector?
Yes.
So as soon as they've kind of got started working on either one of those ideas or lobbying or, you know, even as a policymaker, if you're in the hydrogen department of whatever ministry, then it's hard to just turn around and say, well, most of this doesn't make sense. We need to focus on stuff at the top of the ladder, which is fertilizers, petrochemicals, so desulfurization, hydrocracking. Right, we need if you take crude oil, you want to turn it into petrol, you have to do something to it. Lots of hydrogen involved there, and then maybe long duration storage, steel, aviation fuel, shipping fuel. Right, that is, by the way, that would be a colossal market just there. The top 2 rows of the ladder.
what are the numbers? What does that mean?
So if we did the top row only of the ladder, so globally, we use 94 million tons of essentially what they call grey and black hydrogen. So hydrogen from gas, hydrogen from coal every year, 94 million tons, and that produces 2.3% of global emissions. If you said, right, we're just going to go to green hydrogen, right? Green, i.e. made from renewables. So there's other forms of clean hydrogen. You can make blue hydrogen by using natural gas capturing the CO2. You can do pink hydrogen from nuclear. But if you said, no, I'm a fundamentalist. I'm a renewables fundamentalist. And by the way, they're out there. That someone will be listening to this. Right? It's got to be green.
Hello, you.
Yeah, hello, green fundamentalists. Welcome to the... But if you did that, you would need as much wind and solar times 1.5 as has been built to date, just to do the top row.
So hold on. I didn't what, globally?
Globally.
So
globally.
all of the wind and solar ever
so
built.
We have reached the point with wind and solar, quite extraordinary, and it's a data point that I think, you know, a lot of people don't realize. 15% of all electricity globally is now produced with wind and solar. 15%. All the people who said it's nonsense, it's marginal, it's alternative, right? It's 15%, and the curve is rapidly ramping upwards, okay? But that 15...
Carl, is that installed capacity or is that
installed.
in gigawatt hours?
No. Gigawatt hours.
Or
so
terawatt hours?
That's not capacity. That's not...
So that's with load factors?
Yes.
Okay.
In other words, that's terawatt hours, not terawatts. Or
yes.
It's gigawatt hours. It's actual production, right? Yeah. Which is, you know, from a standing start 20 years ago, incredible, right? But that 15%, all of the wind and solar that generates that 15%, actually in the 15 there's probably a little tiny bit of biomass, you know, the sort of DRAX and so, but that's tiny. But multiply that by 1.5 and take all of that, make hydrogen, and you could clean up just the top row of the ladder, which is just fertilizers and petrochemicals use, right?
Wow.
Now, multiply that by another 3,
by the way,
and you can do the second row.
That would be a win, right? If we could build 1.5 times all the solar and wind we've ever built and green up that top bit of the hydrogen ladder, that is a great win.
It would be a great win, right? What I would say is two caveats, actually. Number one, you need to do it at the same time as continuing to green electricity, right? Okay. Including, if you said, right, that's my goal, I'm just going to green the top row, that's it, total focus, we're going to do that, right? Don't forget, you've got the rest of electricity, the 85%, or in fact, take out, you know, nuclear and the other clean and so on, you've still got about 60% of electricity to green, right, globally. And don't forget that you've also got all the other things that you've now turned your back on the ladder. In other words, transportation and heating, which also have to be electrified, also with clean electricity, renewables or nuclear. So, you know, let's say it takes...
These numbers are crazy, aren't they?
The scale is vast.
Not crazy.
Vast.
We're going to have to do it one way or another.
Well,
but it is bonkers.
So the other caveat, the second caveat, if you said, right, we're just going to do all the renewables, we're going to devote it all to cleaning up that top row and spend 5 years doing that, and then we're done with hydrogen on the top row.
Yeah.
The problem with that is those renewables that you built to do that would be much better used sticking them into a heat pump where their impact is multiplied by 3, 4, 5, 6, or stick them into a car to replace petrol or diesel where their impact will be multiplied by about 2.5. So
efficient on a sort of on a joules basis, or like on an energy basis, or on a carbon basis.
On removing carbon. Removing carbon. You know, and
wow, that's a spanner in the works, isn't it?
Well, I don't know about spanner in the works. It just puts things in perspective. That of course we have to green the hydrogen that we're already making, the grey and the black. But what it says to me, actually, how I've followed the dots, and that's part of as I say, my role as a commentator is I'm the guy that follows more dots than most people. When you follow those dots, those breadcrumbs, right, where you come out with is we're going to need blue hydrogen because the amount is so colossal. And the supply chain, don't forget the supply chain for wind and solar. Yes, it's all very nice.
Blue being abated.
Blue being exactly.
Carbon capture, that kind of stuff.
Yes, exactly. Carbon capture from natural gas, done right. And a big caveat there around doing it right. But, if you look at the sheer amount, if you said, okay, let's take the top 2 rows. So let's take existing 94 million tons a year, which will grow with economic growth in the developing world, I hope, because that's good, right? Take the second row, so long duration storage, keep the lights on, and deal with shipping and aviation and steel probably, right? Take that lot, that's, and then everything else we'll do electrically because we can, and that's the plan. And now we're just going to say, right, well, let's do it all through renewables. The volume of renewables that you need, we will not be able to build in 25 years, 27 years. It's such a colossal amount of energy. The global economy is so energy hungry, even with energy efficiency, which I'm a huge, huge fan of. And it's just...
So you're saying the amount of renewables, just to come back at you here, the amount of renewables we need to take the whole hydrogen ladder and green the whole thing, we just can't do. It's not going to happen.
To put it in numbers, I did a back of envelope actually a few days ago. If you could grow solar by 20% per year to the point where it meets all of the world's energy use, it would take you something like 40 years.
Okay.
Right? 35, 40 years. Now, you could say, well, why 20%? Actually growing, this is my...
Is that with growing production capacity?
Right.
That's not flatlining now.
No. That would be growing the production, growing installations by 20% per year. Not the installed capacity or the output. That would be growing installations. And remember that, that's a good metric because installations and the supply chain is, that means adding 20% capacity to every solar silicon production, ingot production, wafer production, panel production, installation capability, planning permissions. Everything has to grow. So there's been no industry in the world other than IT probably that has grown, 20% per year. And
that's quite uncomfortable.
For 40 years.
That's quite an uncomfortable thing to get your head around, right? Because the answer, we're not going to green it. Everything is not going to be completely green. We're going to have to do some other stuff. You say we're going to need some blue hydrogen, which, again, for bods listening who aren't hydrogen folks, that's burning gas, making hydrogen, and then taking the carbon, sucking the carbon out and storing it somewhere.
Well, it's not burning the gas.
Okay, yes.
So when I said the caveat on doing it right, there's 2 things we have to do in that process. You're right. It is taking the C out of the CH4, right?
Yes.
It's taking the carbon out of the natural gas. And we have to do it right. That means 2 things. Number 1, we have to really take the C out, not just 80% of it, 90% of it, 60% of it, which is what has been done so far when we've tried carbon capture. It means taking 95% plus. And I personally think we should be trying for 97 or 99 because the rest we have to do through offsets, which is a whole other ball, ball of string, right?
Yeah.
So we have to capture 95% and secure it permanently, not just sort of use it for other things, but secure it permanently. The other thing is that natural gas is very powerful greenhouse gas itself. If you have 3 or 4% escaping in that process, you might as well not bother with any of it, right? Because it's so much more powerful than CO2 as a global warming agent, right?
Yeah,
so
the methane.
The methane,
yeah.
Right? And by the way, just out of interest, hydrogen is also a very powerful greenhouse gas. So hydrogen on a 20-year basis is 33 times more powerful than CO2. On a lifetime basis, it's 11 times more powerful. On a 100-year basis, 11 times more powerful.
What does that word mean, powerful, in this
Well,
situation?
it means that the effect, so if you were going to release a kilo of CO2 or a kilo of hydrogen, the hydrogen, or
the atmosphere.
one kilo of hydrogen versus 33 kilos of CO2 on a 20-year basis. Right?
Wow.
So, and the reason that's so important is hydrogen loves to escape, right? NASA, when NASA ran the space shuttle program, 45%, actually I think it's 46% of all the hydrogen that it purchased for the space shuttles ended up escaping. Now we can do better than that.
But NASA don't know what they're doing. They're not very good at precision
What does
instruments.
NASA know about hydrogen, about handling hydrogen, right? Every time they try and handle hydrogen, they have to cancel the launch, right? As we've seen.
Yeah.
Which either tells you that NASA don't know what they're doing, which I don't believe,
No.
or it shows how difficult the stuff is to handle. And it's a greenhouse gas. But so with this thing called blue hydrogen, we should really be getting down to, let's call it 0.1, 0.2% fugitive methane.
Okay.
Really, we know we can do it because we do it in the North Sea basin, the Scandinavians. I put my hand up. I'm an advisor to Equinor, which is probably the best in the world at addressing this issue. But we need to do that in Kazakhstan and in I don't want to even mention Russia, but wherever there's gas, we need to be getting down to 0.1, 0.2% fugitive emissions. And luckily, capturing methane is more profitable than letting it escape, so that we've got a big ally in economics. But still, that's a real challenge. But yeah, it is. Look, it is daunting. We're not going to do it all via solar. The example I gave, 40 years or whatever, is just if it's solar. We've got solar, we've got wind, we've got offshore wind, we've got floating offshore, geothermal. I'm an advisor to a great company called EVOR, EAVOR. Don't ask me why they spell it that way, but it's called EVOR, and it's closed-loop geothermal, which is enormously promising. It's nothing to do with fracking, the seismicity risk, all the things people don't like about geothermal is essentially not there. It's just a lot of drilling. But, if you can get the costs of drilling down, we could start producing a lot of heat, and probably also it'll be economic for electricity. Now, there's also further out. We've got small modular reactors or nuclear. We've got fusion. We've got all sorts of innovations that will help us in the, let's call it 2040 to 2060, 2040 to 2070 range. Now, but, if we really want to do most of the heavy lifting by 2050, we've just got to use... The article you mentioned in The Economist, which came out today, my article, is really saying we cannot... So Vinod Khosla, the great venture capitalist, says we should not deploy wind and solar because they're kind of difficult to integrate. In fact, he says they can't be integrated. But we should wait until we get these magic breakthroughs. And my article says, we do not have time. First of all, these things are not as hard as you think, or not as hard as Vinod thinks. But also, we just don't have time to wait decades for the next, the fusion breakthrough to become something that we can deploy, right across the world.
Well, if you're listening and you want to read that, we'll put the link to in the show notes. I just want to come back to the ladder for a second. I just want to make sure that we've steel-manned this argument, right? Because you've said a lot. You've said some fascinating things, and the ladder is creating a lot of discussion in the industry about what's the appropriate use of human capital or actual financial capital in getting this thing done. So if I was going to sit on the other side, how do we trust the hydrogen ladder? What's the it's been through a few versions. How do we know that the numbers kind of make sense?
It's a great question, and I'm going to sort of not answer it, because what I'm going to say is don't trust it, right? Because what the intention is to get people thinking, and it's actually quite sort of subversive, because what it really does is it switches the view from what I call the Swiss Army knife view, the hydrogen economy, the hydrogen world view, which is essentially hydrogen can do everything, and therefore it will do everything, and it'll be pervasive. And so if you look at, for instance, the European hydrogen strategy, 430 billion euros that they want to have spent, private money, public money, money from the EU, from states, from regions, and so on. But it's all on hydrogen production, mainly green, so it's renewables, electrolysis, and then distribution. But when it comes to why you need this, it's just taken as read that you need it, right? And of
Really?
course, yeah.
Yes.
Dive in and you'll see it's very, very vague on the uses. And so what you've got these hydrogen sort of lobbyists doing is they're saying there's going to be all these uses, so we need to produce lots of hydrogen. But then they're turning around and they're in the process of that pivot when I interrupted them with the ladder of saying, well, there's going to be all this cheap hydrogen, so now we need to think of use cases. Right? And the logic of that is very poor, obviously.
We should do a link to your demand side piece in Bloomberg as well. That covers this really well.
Well, so I did my kind of hydrogen journey, or my public hydrogen journey, started with two pieces on Bloomberg NEF, one on the demand side, one on the supply side, dissecting exactly who was saying what and some of the physics behind both and the economics behind both. But what the ladder does, which came a bit later, is it draws the eye. It's like a sort of magician's trick. It draws the eye to the demand side. What are we going to use it for? And it makes a really important point, which is hydrogen will have to win or lose case by case, use case by use case. Just because you want to do clean hydrogen fertilizer, it doesn't mean that there's any benefit to a clean hydrogen bus, right? Or scooter or boiler, right? They're just not connected. There are, of course, connections in the sense that if you've got hydrogen, and where the fight is now getting really kind of focused is on distribution of hydrogen in the community to the high street and the home. Because if you have hydrogen, it's really a question of whether we have a hydrogen distribution grid or not. We'll have a hydrogen transmission grid, right? The big hydrogen pipes, or big pipes, will link. The stuff that's at the top of the ladder all happens in industrial hubs.
Yeah.
Right? It'll be Teesside, it'll be Humberside, it'll be around Port Ellesmere, in the UK, and every country where we've got listeners. Hello, listeners from around the world. You can find a map of hydrogen hubs. In fact, I can provide it. We can put one in the notes. And the hubs will be around the world. Industrial use of hydrogen, top of the ladder. And those will be connected by pipelines, no question. A lot of pipelines coming from North Africa, from the Gulf region up to Europe, absolutely. Very, very much in favour of that. The fight is now whether those hydrogen pipes continue out into the petrol stations, the high street, the shopping malls to provide the heating and those sorts of things, where I think that makes essentially no sense at all. And that we're not going But it really, in a sense, it doesn't matter what I think. I just think it's not going to happen.
Yes.
So there are some interactions because, of course, if you had a hydrogen distribution network, you might hang a few more things on it. But fundamentally, what the ladder does, it makes people think use case by use case. And I don't mind if people disagree with the current iteration, which dates back to, I think, summer 2021. So it's nearly 2 years old. I haven't found great need to change it. And it was actually group sourced. I mean, it was crowdsourced because what I did is put a version out there and people said, oh, that's stupid, that's wrong. And I'm like, fine, excellent. Now I'm even, I've got an even better version. And I released it under a commons license. So if anybody wants to use it, change it, as long as you credit, be my guest. It's not mine, it's ours. But it's making the point that you look at the use cases, and if you want to tweak them and move them around, in a sense, I've won. Right? Because the fundamental point is we don't have enough, or the points are that we don't have enough clean hydrogen. It's going to be very difficult to get enough clean hydrogen for decades to do all the things that you could do. And therefore, there's a sense of rationing or prioritization. Yes. And when you ask, well, how much is it backed up? What do the figures show and so on? There are legions, there are hundreds, possibly thousands of academic papers that I may have looked at, that others have written since, that really back it up.
Well, what's been incredible to watch is having followed your work and some of the other hydrogen community on Twitter and LinkedIn, and every possible rock has been thrown at this thing. I think it's there has been so much incentive to tear it down. Yeah. And it still stands.
So there's a fantastic article somebody wrote, and it turns out that he's like the financial controller of a food company, and he's written this article, and it's so long, it's like 20,000 words. Even it's about and it's called Liebreich's hydrogen ladder debunked.
Oh, the hit piece. That was bizarre.
I got to be completely honest. it's about me, and even I couldn't be bothered to read it because it's just so long. But it basically says Michael invested in ChargePoint and EV charging business in the US, and that has that's obviously what he's the idea that I would sort of invest in ChargePoint at random and then try and find a bunch of spurious arguments to attack any competitor, any sector. I mean, it's so ridiculous. And of course, it's an ad hominem, and the whole thing's utterly absurd.
It's just odd. I read a bit of it, I must say.
It's really odd.
And it's just bizarre.
But you're right.
But the headline grabs people's attention, right? It's the FUD thing, the fear, uncertainty, doubt thing.
And people have asked me, what do I think about it, and do I want to write a rebuttal of a rebuttal? No, I don't. I don't care. If people want, they can go and do your own research. The point about the ladder is not that it's right and guaranteed and it's the latest, peer-reviewed with the 4 decimal places of economic. No, it's a framework that encapsulates. By the way, it encapsulates a lot of the soft. The soft thinking as well about safety or about change and about geopolitics. There's a lot in there that I've kind of encapsulated. But it's all about spurring the right discussions.
Well, on behalf of all of us, thanks for putting it together and sharing it.
Can I give you one example where I've pulled together a lot, and that is on heating. And I put heating very low down. Heating is on the front lines right now.
What do we mean? Do we mean
hydrogen boilers?
Worcester boilers in your house burning hydrogen instead of methane?
So that's exactly the Worcester Bosch or Valent. I don't want to give any plugs to any particular. They're all fine companies, and they will, by the way, make fine heat pumps. Baxi, Valent, Worcester Bosch, fine heat pump manufacturers as well. But there is a massive effort from the heating industry and the gas industry, particularly, by the way, the gas network owners. The kind of, Cadent, SGN, NGN, etc.
The pipes to your house.
The pipes to your house, the small pipes to your house, the district, because it's existential. As I said, for me, I see no reason for that. That's basically going to be shut down by 2050 or whenever we're, off. Because if you're off gas, if you're off carbon and you're off gas, you don't need those networks.
My house doesn't have gas to it. I imagine a lot of new builds now won't have gas to it.
No new builds should have gas. That's absolutely obvious. But some still do, but it's good to hear that yours doesn't.
It wasn't a choice.
The heating, we talked about the efficiency of the heat pump, the amount of FUD about the heat pumps, they only work with underfloor heating and they can't work in a drafty house and they don't work in this. It's all a well-installed heat pump installed by a competent engineer, and that's actually the issue. We are very, very, very short of competent heating engineers in the UK. Real problem, the whole of that sort of industry is talking about hydrogen boilers. And there's this campaign called Hello Hydrogen.
I've seen this.
And you've got
the hashtag Hello Hydrogen thing.
Hashtag Hello Hydrogen. You've got Mike Foster, who's the CEO of the Energy Utility Alliance in the UK, who's running this campaign saying hydrogen boilers are tried and tested in UK homes. Right. The truth is, there's 2 show homes with no one living in them that have had hydrogen boilers operating since, I think it was, for 18 months. That's it. So then, by no means tried and tested.
But what about a blend, right? You hear about there being a blend.
Let's come back to blends. I just want to talk about the home, right? Because I'm on a roll on the home. And
do it.
One of the issues, so there's all this issue about, the economics, right? The industry doesn't want to talk about how much hydrogen for home use will cost, right? It definitely won't be as cheap as natural gas. Probably 2 to 3 times as expensive. They don't want to talk about that. They don't want to talk about the nitrous oxides that will be produced in your home. They don't want to talk about the fact that there isn't enough green hydrogen, so it'll be blue hydrogen, which, by the way, if you thought people objected to fracking, they're going to love when blue hydrogen is being piped into their homes. But also, you can make hydrogen in the home, not the boiler. The boiler is the easy bit, but hydrogen in the home. The report for Bayes says that every room with an appliance needs to have a 4x4 inch vent to the outside, non-closable, within 50 centimetres of the ceiling for safety reasons.
Wow.
That's the room with the boiler, the room with the gas meter, the kitchen, if you've got a hydrogen hob, which is producing nitrous oxides and giving your kids asthma, so you shouldn't have that anyway. The cold front room with that fake log heater, maybe the conserver, wherever you've got gas, You have to knock a hole in the wall within 50 centimeters of the ceiling. The industry doesn't want to talk to you about that. So all of that is encapsulated in why is heating so low down in the ladder?
Yeah, bonkers, isn't it?
Now blending.
What about blending, right? Because there's been a lot of, excuse my ignorance, but looking at the media, it looks like this is already happening, right? How do you stop this thing? They're already doing trials, everyone's on board. What's happening there?
So blending is the idea that the current pipes would need to be, and they are being upgraded by these gas network companies. They're taking, they're spending money right now upgrading for 100% hydrogen, but you can meanwhile put 20% hydrogen into the existing network. I say it is thought because actually research out of the National Renewable Energy Lab in the US suggests that over time even that is probably not a good idea. But
why? Sort of corrosion and that stuff?
Yeah, embrittlement and so on and so on. So let's just take as in fact NREL's recent research is also about what it does to plastic pipes. But anyway, let's say you can put 20% hydrogen into the normal gas network. So it's great. We're going to be using clean hydrogen and reducing our emissions. We can put 20%. The problem is that's 20% hydrogen by volume is only 7% by energy content because hydrogen is so voluminous, right? Yeah. Such a non-dense gas. So you're doing all this. So here you've got an industry that's pushing for blending to reduce our emissions by 7%. By the way, they could reduce emissions by 7% by sending competent engineers around to tune the boilers in people's homes, right? This they don't do because they want to do this other thing that protects the value of their networks and of their boiler manufacturing. So now you've got blending. What do you do? What actually happens to that blended gas, right? You've gone to all the cost of making clean hydrogen, whether it's green from renewables, whether it's blue with autothermal reforming and capturing this and storing that. So you've got this gas, which you've spent a lot of money on, and what do? Well, mainly you do two things. You mainly immediately generate electricity. Well, hang on a second. Why did we bother making it from electricity just to turn it back to electricity with huge, with 70% round trip losses or whatever? That makes no sense at all. Or you're going to use it for heating, but then why didn't you just have a heat pump, which is going to, so if you take electricity to blended gas to heating is a really stupid use of electricity, right?
Well, you've got this massive asset base of distribution pipes around the world for these kind of for gas, which are going to become stranded. Yeah, stranded. A bit like I imagine stables when we stopped using horses and got motor cars all over the place. It's a bit like that, right?
It's a great analogy because not so much stables but paddocks.
Paddocks. Yeah,
here in the UK, everybody lives in the country has got a paddock. Why have you got a paddock? Because everybody used to have a horse, right? But there's no horses now. But we become incredibly emotionally attached to paddocks because they define the British countryside. Are we going to be as attached to the pipes? No, they're stranded assets, and that needs to be dealt with. So right now you've got Mark Carney, Brookfield Asset Management. Right, Mark Carney is the sustainability. I think he's the deputy chair, or anyway. And they own SGN, which is one of these big natural gas networks. And SGN is one of the companies funding these industry lobbying drives. So there's Macquarie and a group and other investors. I'm just singling out very unfairly too, but they're high-profile ones, Brookfield and Macquarie. So Macquarie and a consortium owns Cadent, the former National Grid gas distribution grid. Actually, and they've just bought, Macquarie has just bought what's now called National Gas, which is the big pipes, the ones that I think are probably, the transmission. So I think that's probably okay.
This is in the UK.
In the UK.
So when you see the vans with the Cadent on the side, it's Cadent, all that stuff.
Exactly. Cadent is in the business of gas distribution to homes and SMEs and high streets and so on. And by the way, it's National Grid in the US. They've got gas distribution, but it's around the world. You've got these networks. And if you commit to 2050 net zero and you believe the ladder, then those networks have to be shut down they can carry biogas, right? And I'm actually very much in favor of biogas. I just think that what we should be using it for is actually in sectors that are very, very difficult to decarbonize electrically. So as an example, the biogas would make a fantastic solution for shipping. We already use CNG in ships, so why not, instead of CNG, CBG or compressed biogas? And that would enable a lot of shipping to be decarbonized. So why would we go off and put it into homes, which we can heat electrically? That makes no sense. So those networks, but there's a big regulatory backlog, because right now, if Cadent or SGN dig up the road to make their network, future-proof and hydrogen-ready, they can then charge homeowners for that work out into the 2060s.
Yeah.
Well, hang on a second. It's not going to. I'm so convinced that it will not be carrying hydrogen in 2060. I think that's the debate that we have to have. That's
These are big calls, Michael, right? Huge calls.
Huge.
And how do you feel about making such big calls? Because you're going up against some of the biggest asset owners in the world, right? This is big money. You're going up and saying, I don't think that bit of the business makes sense in the future.
Right.
And how do you handle that? I'm asking you as a human being, right? What is that like?
So
Does it feel risky?
No, because I think there's part of me which enjoys I enjoy a bit of a scrap. I've got broad shoulders, and if somebody wants to disagree, and by the way, I've probably made a wrong call when I've said that you can't have a long haul hydrogen fueled plane unless you want to go to flying wings and crazy stuff that we're not going to see in our lifetimes. It's impossible to have a long haul plane fueled by hydrogen. Well, the Whittle lab in Cambridge reached out and they invited me to come and visit. And I'm a geek. I would love to see the Whittle lab. And I went up there and I met amazing scientists. And they showed me why I'm wrong. And I'm wrong on that one. Now, the corollary is you can't get liquid hydrogen to Heathrow, right? For all sorts of just energy balance reasons. So we're still not going to have hydrogen long haul flights. But I'm quite happy to put my hand up when I'm wrong. I've done that, on a number of, it's kind of my hit rate is better than a chimpanzee typing or somebody blindfold throwing darts at a dartboard. It's not 100%, but on the hydrogen stuff, I'm right. And what I'm waiting for you to crack a smile there, but I feel very confident. And my old team, Bloomberg NEF, just released figures for the investment in the transition technologies, principally renewable energy and electrification of transport for 2022. $1.1 trillion. Wow. $1.1 trillion.
Now we're talking.
And there's a slide that they released with it, and it shows the growth. And it goes all the way back to 2004. Why 2004? Why not 2000? The reason is the data sets that I created started in 2004, the year I started New Energy Finance, and it starts at 36 billion, right? So go back to 2004, when I said renewable energy is going to be big, it was 36 billion only, right? And you see the line grows to now about about half of the 1.1 trillion, a bit over half, I think, is renewable electricity, generating capacities, right? So 36, so in 2004, I say this is going to be big, and it grows from 36 billion to half a trillion, right? In 2010, I went all in on electrification of transport, and the amount being invested in it was peanuts. It was basically the early rounds of investment in Tesla, and that was it. There were a couple of other companies that didn't make it. So Think in Norway was just, and I said, electrification of transport is it. And the investment went from 0 to over $500 billion, right? So I've got two really big calls right in the last 20 years. And a big call is that a lot of this hydrogen stuff is, so what on the supply side, right? All of the projects being announced that are on the supply side of hydrogen will be fine, right? And the reason is they will produce a few tens of thousands of tons, maybe a few hundreds of thousands of tons, maybe altogether a few millions of tons of hydrogen, all of which we can absorb into the hydrogen markets as they are today. You can just make, Namibia is never going to be supplying hydrogen to Germany, but it might easily make green fertilizer and stick it on a ship and sell it in Germany to replace the fertilizer which Germany can no longer make using Russian gas. So Namibia will be fine for producing hydrogen. All of those supply side, all of the big projects in Australia. And, we might get hydrogen, if you produce enough hydrogen, and then it might find a use in the steel industry, right? I think we talked about the volume, so it's hard to see how you could do the whole steel industry. What we will not be doing, I guarantee you what we'll not be doing, is bringing in iron ore from Australia and Brazil to ThyssenKrupp in Germany, right? And then bringing hydrogen from Namibia, Chile, Australia or Brazil or wherever into Germany, or even from the Gulf by pipeline, most likely, in order to make steel, primary steel production.
With hydrogen.
And then competing with Australia. And what will happen is we'll see a migration of a number of industries. And I don't know, what can I say? I just feel very confident. I think this you'd be very brave to bet against it. And what we'll see falling away is hydrogen buses, hydrogen trains.
That's what I want to ask you
hydrogen
about.
Heating. That's all going to go away.
So what happens? What's the next? What are the next big moves here? Because my fear is we build stuff that we don't need or that doesn't make sense. We build a load of this stuff, and it's just a waste of time, energy, resources, where we should be doing electrification instead in those areas. So what do we do what happens next, and do you think that's going to happen?
The key word that you use there is time, right? Because frankly, if we waste 50 billion building stupid stuff, it's kind of a bagatelle, right? Over 5 years, 10 billion a year. I mean, I don't know, can't remember how many trillions the global economy is, and the UK economy is a couple of trillion pounds.
It's an HS2.
It's one, but if you spread it, globally, it's not. These are, I don't know. So bagatelle is a very sort of dramatic, but also don't forget that money is still providing, some jobs, and it's providing learning, and there's a bunch of engineers coming out the other end who will know never to do that again, and so on. So I'm not that bothered about a bit of waste. The idea that we're going to be able to choreograph this transition so there's never a wasted ounce of effort, that's just wishful thinking. We shouldn't think like that. But I worry about the time. I worry about, for instance, in the UK, the government is going to decide in 2026 on the balance between hydrogen and electrification for heating. The decision should be today, because it's already clear. And I worry about, if your asset is a distribution network for gas, then you can talk about hydrogen for 5 years. If you can confuse for 5 years, that's 5 more years that you'll get to use your asset. And by the way, it might be the 5 years in which you retire as an executive, if you're senior enough, right? And I worry about that. I really worry about the time. We have not got enough engineers that can install heat pumps in this country. Poland, last year, heat pump installations grew by 127%, right? Why do we consider that impossible in the UK? Why can't we go?
If you look at the news, it looks like it's happening over here, right?
It's happening.
It's just not fast enough.
But 30,000 installations will become 45,000, will become whatever. And meanwhile, in I don't know exactly. I don't know the absolute numbers in Poland and Germany, but they're well into the hundreds of thousands. Yeah. Now, Boris, bless him, said we should be installing 600,000 heat pumps per year in the UK by 2030, and everybody's like, "Don't be ridiculous. The number's only 20,000 or 15,000, whatever. It's so small." So. Yeah, but that is what we should be doing and more, and we can do it. We should be just reskilling. And the problem is, of course, what you've got is a lot of gas engineers, gas qualified engineers. You can stick a boiler on your wall, but we need more electricians, and we need more sort of hydronics.
It's a lot of friction.
More people who can do heat loss calculations for homes, those sorts of things. So I worry that, and what we should be doing, of course, if we're not losing 3 to 5 years. And of course, it's the same on, we see, for instance, Montpellier in France that had fuel cell buses, and now they want to get rid of them, and they want to go only to electric buses. Well, that's very. I'll give you a story going back to 2000 and, 14, 15, 16, 17, I was on the board of Transport for London, and we had hydrogen buses. And they were
Here in London.
Operational. We still have. We still got some, right? They were given to us by some EU program so they didn't cost very much.
The good old days.
We had 100 electric buses. Yeah, the good old days.
Yeah.
Oh,
Free money from Europe.
Bless Boris, and now bless the EU as well, right? And so we had these buses, and we had 100 electric buses, and I was on the board. I was chair of the sustainability and safety panel, and I was saying we should be accelerating and doing electric. We should just go electric. We had the whole air quality thing, right? We should just go electric. So there was Dieselgate and all this going on. The time was ripe. Shenzhen had 16,500 electric buses. Moscow had more electric buses than we had, right? And what management said was, well, no, but it could be hydrogen. We don't want to move too fast. We don't want to make a wrong decision. I said, it's not going to be hydrogen, trust me, right? This is even before the hydrogen ladder. It's not going to be hydrogen. And the TfL Surface Transport Management very much didn't want to impose any cost or work on their fraternal colleagues in the bus industry, right? Because there's not enough electricity in the bus garages. They'd have had to invest, and that was to be avoided because they all wanted to end up being directors of those companies and being friendly with their mates. I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what it was. And I said, okay, to break the logjam, show me a route, a typical route. You can do a long one and a short one if you want, if there's a difference.
A
bus route. And show me how much it would cost to serve it with bio-CNG, with the different options that you've got, electric, hydrogen, or biofuels. Because we're not going to have diesel. We're not going to keep buying diesel. You can use biodiesel if you want, or you can use compressed gas. But I want to see that route, a route, served these different ways. Full costs, the capital costs, the maintenance costs, the fuel costs, the whole lot. And on the board, as a board member, I could not get them to do that analysis, right? And why? Because they were basically using the hydrogen buses as a way of delaying electrification of the buses.
Wow.
Now, that I don't even think was that untypical. That was then. That was a really concrete example of what was going on.
It's not that complicated a decision. That's not even big policy.
Well,
it is fairly big.
But also the argument was, it's too complicated to analyze. Like, excuse me, I've built a team of 300 people now, or at the time it was probably 250 people. We can do this analysis. Trust me. You can even give Bloomberg the data. They'll do it for you, right? But the point was that the confusion was allowing a very comfortable status quo to be preserved. And I think that's what worries me, not whether we waste 50 billion on hydrogen, but it's the preservation of the status quo that delays then the rapid move to scalable solutions.
So I want to ask you a couple of questions that's slightly different now. One is about your podcast. So your podcast, you're now on 116 episodes, 117 episodes, something like that. You've had some huge names on. Do you want to just tell us why you started the Cleaning Up podcast and what the journey's been like for you? What's the vision? Where's it going? What's next?
So I wish I knew the answers to the where's it going, what next. The history of it, the way it started was during lockdown. So one of the things that I do is quite a lot of paid public speaking. Right? I get banks and so on. Hedge
like the
funds.
Hydrogen Council.
I'm not going to comment on any individual commercial relationship. It wouldn't be at all appropriate. But that's something that they never talked to me about this in school careers advice. But actually, there is a market for public speaking, and I've got myself to the point in my career, and maybe my shtick, the jokes I tell are funny. I don't know what, but people pay. And then that all fell away during the pandemic. And so I had time on my hands. I wasn't traveling. It was like 70, 80 days travel a year. And also I was thinking about, what is my role in the industry? What is my value, and how can I enhance my personal value and my value to the transition and to those investing and working on this. And I thought, well, I can use this time to reconnect with some of the big names that I have met. And
thanks for the invite, Michael.
Yeah, you haven't received. It must have got lost somewhere. Email. It's very unreliable email.
Yeah. No, I'm just. I'll keep checking anyway.
Some of the colossal figures, like Quentin and so on. But no, I had, as an example, I had Christiana Figueres, who was the head of the UNFCCC, during led to Paris. In fact, I've had a lot of the participants in the Paris negotiations. Amber Rudd from the UK, and I've had the US negotiator, Todd Stern, and lots of those. I had Tony Blair. I've
That's
had
a great episode.
some just Ban Ki-moon.
Yanis Varoufakis. I really enjoyed that one.
Most popular episode so far, Yanis Varoufakis.
I love the guy.
The Greek finance minister during the
Rockstar.
Greek crisis, who says that we should nationalise the entire electricity system, the entire system. And during that episode, I thought I let him make it clear that he knew very, very little about how the electrical system worked, vanishingly little. And all of his followers came onto the social media afterwards saying, how brilliant, and that Liebreich guy who interviewed him was an asshole, pardon me. But it was a good episode. And actually, I think it does highlight some of the social tensions around energy and the passions around it.
I'm a big Yanis fan in general. I love his writing. What do we teach our children about the economy or something like that? Was just fantastic.
Exactly, and Grown-Ups in the Room.
Grown-Ups in the Room.
Grown-Ups in the Room. His book on how Greece was treated during the financial crisis. I'm a big fan as well, but not of his policies on electricity, obviously. Actually, very funny. One of the things that came out of that episode happened during the episode. He was incredibly oozing with condescension and scathing about the contribution of Greg Jackson and Octopus building the Kraken software, which is so amazing, kind of, that enabled us to ride through the recent, very cold snap, and we needed electricity, and they were able to use the agile tariff and whatever to, encourage people to switch off demand. Varoufakis said, any graduate student could have built that for any nationalized electricity utility. And I'm like, are you kidding, mate? Anyway, so I wanted to reconnect with people that I had met, and I wanted to, it was also about signaling to the world who might book me later for speeches, who I know, why I'm not your average, model building, energy consultancy, whatever, that I'm actually, sort of seeing this, through some good lenses. Ban Ki-moon is another one that I was on the advisory group for Sustainable Energy for All, and I had all of the Damilola Ogunbiyi, who now runs Sustainable Energy for All, Kande Yomkela, who set it up, which is now SDG 7. We got it to the point where it was adopted as SDG 7. So, really, really great fun. It's got a life of its own. I'm finding I'm having to do more work than I expected on it. Partly I have to prep. I just had Yorgo Chatzimarkakis, another fun episode on hydrogen.
Pusher episode, right?
I called, every episode gets a little sort of tagline, and his is the hydrogen pusher, because his role is to promote hydrogen. He's probably the sort of most influential hydrogen pusher in the world, based in Brussels. But you have to prep. You can't go into something like that unprepared. Or Julia Pike, who's steering Sizewell C through the process of being funded by the government and played a huge role on Hinkley C and so on. These are complex issues. They need to be dealt with great seriousness, I think.
You need to show them the respect they deserve in coming really well prepared and knowing what their thing is.
Yeah, I try to do that. I mean, Yorgo Chatzimarkakis might argue that I wasn't quite as respectful as he would have liked, but that's also to do with content.
Yes.
Let's put it that way. As individuals, I've got nothing but respect for, and even, to be honest, even the people that I had Farhana Yamin, who's the lawyer who stuck herself to the Shell headquarters. She came on. And as well as later, I had Laszlo Varro, who is essentially, he runs the Shell scenarios exercise with a big team at Shell. So I get both sides of the debate. And of course, as individuals, I have huge respect. And I really thank them for coming on the show, because I'm not the easiest. This is not a flannel interview. This is not, tell me the most marvelous thing about the product that you've put on the market. They are challenging discussions. It is. Where is it going? I'm going to keep doing it. I may have to reduce the frequency, because it is
every week. Isn't
it's
it?
every week for 3 seasons. It's about 42 episodes a year.
A lot of work, because it's so much bigger than prep and recording as well. You've got to promote it. You've got to edit it. You've got to.
The editing, we don't edit. We go straight through. But yes, it's the promotion also, and people want to engage. They want to disagree with a bit or whatever, and I think I owe it also to the audience to try to answer as many questions as I can. So first of all, where is it going? First of all, it's a fantastic collection. It's achieved everything I set out to do, number one. Number two, it's a fantastic collection of content. if anybody ever wants to write a book on the transition and they want to know what, Rachel Kite of the World Bank and Sustainable Energy for All, and now the Fletcher School, incredible figure in all of this, invented blended finance for clean energy while she was at the World Bank. So if they want to know what she thinks, it's a fantastic, vignette, but it's, the archive, I think, is going to be just extraordinary. It is already 120 episodes almost. I want to continue doing it. I think actually it should be embedded in a broader sort of media property around the transition, where the bit that I do is the senior level, challenging, almost like Hard Talk on the BBC type interviews.
I love that show. Yeah,
I love that. That was my sort of model for some of it. But could I envisage, for instance, bringing in a second interviewer? It would be nice to have not only just to get a week off, but to vary the voices. And also, by the way, I'm falling behind on diversity. So that's something I need to work on, through the guests, but maybe also through finding a host. I actually wanted to get Mariana Mazzucato, who was also one of our guests. I reached out to her and I wondered whether she wanted to sort of tag team, because we both want the transition. We both believe in industrial strategy, but she's very much comes from a left tradition, pretty hard left. Yes. And I come from a center-right, quite dry. I mean, if it wasn't for climate change, I might even be a libertarian, or the environment and climate change. But that I think would have interesting chemistry. But something like that might come along. Don't know. All offers are open. If anybody's listening, you know what to do with cleaning up, let me know.
Well, you heard it here first. Anyway, a great deal of work and effort goes into it, and some fantastic conversations. I want to finish up now on your view on the energy system. I want to ask you a very kind of difficult question now, which is, what do you think is going to happen? What's your expectation about how fast we do this stuff, and are we going to achieve the things that we said we were going to do in Paris? And then the final question is, what's your contrarian view? What do you believe that a lot of people don't believe? But if we start with the first one, what's the prediction, Michael? What do you think? Where do we go from here?
So my lodestar for nearly 20 years now is that we are in a transition, and it will be a complete transition. We will not be burning fossil fuels in 2100, for sure. Now, what's to play for is obviously some of the technology mix along the way, right? But also whether we get there by 2050 or 2070 or 2100. That's what we've got to play for. The reason we won't be burning things is essentially a stupid way to do what we need. If you need heat, then heat pumps are more efficient, and if you need work, why would why burn things when you can produce work directly? I mean, so it's just a kind of thermodynamically inelegant thing to do, as well as having all these environmental downsides.
So no fossil fuels by the end of the century. So that's a big call.
But interestingly enough, if you go back to 2015, you mentioned Paris. Shortly before Paris, there was a G7 meeting at Schloss Elmau. Angela Merkel hosted it, and that was the first time that that leaders of major economies talked about net zero, or zero carbon economies, and they phrased it as by the end of the century, right? And that then rolled into the Paris Agreement. That was the groundbreaking work that led to the Paris Agreement, that and also the US negotiation with China, which was happening in parallel. What Paris actually says is to keep the temperature well below 2 degrees and as close to 1.5 as possible. That is Paris, right? Since Paris, there was and Christiana Figueres talks about this on Cleaning Up in her episode, there was the 1.5 degrees report, and the report on the cryosphere, the ice caps in the glaciers, by the UN sort of machine. UNFCCC asked for it, and UNEP then oversaw its production. The IPCC produced it, which is part of UNEP. And
this is sea level rises.
This is all about, but it's not just sea level rise. It's also about what heat waves do to and crop failures and those sorts of things. So we got lots more information on the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, and then of course Greta Thunberg, Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, Sunrise Movement in the US. You're now moving into the US with your business. You'll know more about. You'll start to resonate more with the US references here. So we got focused on 1.5 degrees. I personally believe, and have believed since about 2018, 1.5 degrees is not possible. It's not going to happen. We might be able to get back to 1.5 at some point through direct air capture of CO2, but we're going through 1.5 degrees. But Paris orthodoxy is well below 2 and as close to 1.5 as possible. And that I totally, so first of all, that's exactly what I sign up to. And we can do that where we're going, because net zero by 2100 is 2 degrees, maybe a little bit over. Net zero by 2050, globally, all countries, India, China, all the developing world, as well as the developed world, net zero 2050 would be 1.5 degrees, which I think we're going to miss. So I'm kind of a 27ist.
Okay.
I think we're going to 2070, right? I think we're going to get there. I don't think it'll take till 2100. Because in a sense, if we do nothing, we'll get there then, because of the sort of physics and economics of burning stuff, which is fundamentally dumb. But I think that policy, innovation, creativity, the arc that you're bending, that I've been bending, we'll get there by, let's call it 2060 to 2080. 2060 if we're lucky, and 2080 if we're not. But it'll be in that kind of zone. So that's where I think we're headed.
But it ain't going to be 1.5 degrees.
No, it won't. Well, like I say.
And is that all right? Is that okay?
So let me do two things which are not quite. You ask for things that might be contrarian, and I'll give you two things that are maybe not contrarian, but they're sort of one might not be one. First of all, I nearly said the science is uncertain, right? But that's the wrong phraseology, because that will just get all sorts of people riled up.
Especially the last few years,
writing into the editor. Wait a minute, that's you. There are uncertainties. There are uncertainties about the energy trajectory, where which I think are relatively minor uncertainties, to be honest. There are uncertainties about how the planet responds, and a lot of uncertainties around the very specifics around human outcomes for biodiversity and so on. And so I can't sit here and say, so I'm essentially saying I think we're going to get to 1.8 degrees, right? Because I think we're going to go not to 2. At the moment, if you look at the so-called nationally determined contributions, right? The actual plans that countries have filed with the UN, you get to about 2.5 degrees with uncertainties, right? 2.4, 2.5 with uncertainties, above and below. If you look at the net zero pledges, so about 2/3 of the global economy has pledged net zero 2050. So that's Europe, US, Canada, Japan, South Korea, and so on. And then if you add in China 2060 and India 2070 and a bunch of other countries, then you find that 91% of the global economy has pledged net zero by 2070, right? If that was delivered, we'd be at 1.8 degrees. Okay. And I think that can be delivered. I think that, I can't tell you exactly how, but I think that's that gives us nearly 50 years, right? And I think that nothing that I see about the challenges says, either that it would be easy to beat that or that that's impossible.
Excluding a black swan sort of war or something like that happening. Although it might even happen even with a war.
See, wars are difficult because they obviously slow down economic activity. Well, you get a bulge of economic activity. They slow down the energy transitions, but they also absorb capital. What you don't want is a sort of the worst scenarios are ones where the economy grows like crazy, but nobody cares about sustainability. And that's within the scenario sets, those are the bad outcomes. The black swans, you could think of, okay, well, what happens with, for instance, fusion? Well, that would make it easier, but it probably won't help us until about 2050, 2060. Small modular reactors people talk about, they have no idea how many of them you would need, because if you've got a 100 or a 200 megawatt nuclear reactor, you need 100 megawatt nuclear reactor. You would need 15,400 of them to replace, just to get to where wind and solar are today. So is there going to be a black swan or a white swan, a good event coming out of SMRs? No, it's just not.
Not in time for what we need.
It can help. They can help. Nuclear can certainly play its role. But the idea that you get some people out on Twitter and so on who would be saying, the answer is obviously 100% nuclear, and it's just obviously not. So that's kind of what you asked. What do I think is going to happen? I think we're going to get to net zero around 2070, and it'll be about 1.8 degrees. the reason I talk about the uncertainties is that could either be okay, in other words, an economy and a planet that looks pretty much like now.
That's my question, yeah.
Or it could look much worse, right? All of this stuff about tipping points, sort of tipping points, great episode on cleaning up with Johan Rockstrom, the planetary scientist. And this is not me saying this is essentially him saying this, and he knows better than anybody in the world, that the tipping points, which are very, very real, very concerning, they tend to hit, the impacts of them actually hit in 300, 400, 500 years or more. If the Amazon is going to turn into a savanna, it's not going to do it in 20 years, right? Yes. If the Antarctica or even Greenland are going to melt, they're not going to do it in, even by the end of this century. A really bad outcome might be a meter of sea level rise. It's really hard to see more than that, just given the sort of physics of how big the ice cube is and so on. And the same with things like the tundra, the melting of the permafrost. That's a lot of stuff you need to melt really to produce the outcome, the catastrophic outcomes. They're very real, but they're in hundreds of years. But we will know a lot more about the science of those outcomes will be known much, much more, much better, let's say in 10 years or in 20 years. And, we could be sitting here going, yeah, we can land this thing at 1.8 degrees and it'll be fine. Or we could be saying, okay, we now really understand the Earth system much better, and it's going to be really catastrophic, maybe in 200 or 300 years, but we need to course correct big time.
1.8 is not enough.
1.8 is not enough. And we really need to go back to 350, another great episode of Cleaning Up. Sorry, Bill McKibben, 350.org.
We're going to get all these on the show.
Absolutely.
Izzy's typing in the corner.
This is just like an extended plug. It's fabulous. But if we need to get back to 350, we can, but we'll do it in the second half of the century. We'll do it sort of 20, we'll do direct air capture then to get back to 350 if we have to. And so my kind of contrarian point is that we're actually doing okay, and that we need to value the option value of being able to course correct is not valued at all by kind of the political discourse at the moment. So if you said to Greta Thunberg, well, look, if you're right, we could then do vast amounts of direct air capture by 2050 and still avoid the complete the catastrophic outcomes. That would not be a I don't think she'd have that conversation with you. I'm using her perhaps unfairly as an example, but there's plenty of people, by the way, who are out there on Twitter who don't want to have that conversation.
Right? There's a whole dogma around, and again, I'm not directed to Greta Thunberg, who's had a great impact. I think I respect her greatly, and she's had a huge impact on the conversation. But there is a dogma which is like green or bust, right? Green or nothing. Everything's got to be green, and
instantly,
and
instantly, yeah. Yeah, so you've got, in the UK, the Extinction Rebellion that were, disrupting the traffic, and now it's Just Stop Oil. But at the time, Extinction Rebellion, when they first burst onto the scene, they said the UK should be net zero in 2025. Not 2050. It's a catastrophe. The crops are failing. The people are dying. Which and by the way, the numbers on people dying from hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and so on. Everyone is a tragedy, but the numbers are in the low thousands compared to COVID, which killed probably 20 million. But their view is UK net zero 2025. Well, guess what? There are no net zero tractors, so you can forget food production. There are no net zero, or very few net zero. The distribution of food, the refrigeration of food would be, by 2025. Now, we have seen in history where people have tried to do sort of, not step changes, but, transformation of agricultural systems overnight. And they're called, the Great Leap Forward, the Holodomor, the collectivization, and so on. No, but that's very real. If you listen to those people, you would say, well, that's what they really want is, no diesel for tractors, no trucks delivering, and of course the cities would empty out.
But if you had like a Manhattan Project style, so I guess there's also the issue where we've got high debt to GDP ratios. We can't print money like we used to. There is a limit on this economic machine that we have.
Not according to those folks, because what they say is modern monetary theory, we can just print whatever we want, do whatever we want. Now, of course, inflation is giving them the sort of, what should have been a nursery school lesson to those people, but they missed it because many of them grew up in a period where there was no inflation, and you could print lots, but that's not the case anymore.
It's tricky, but I see where they're coming from. It's like, if we all down tools and spent all our time focusing on this thing, then maybe we get there. But there's a cost. It's all trade-offs.
So would I like to see it go faster? Yes. I mean, I wake up every morning thinking about, I didn't come into this as an activist saying, I've got to save the world. How should I do it? Right? I wanted to build a great information service that was working on stuff that was consistent with my beliefs, I'm not really an environmentalist, I'm an outdoorsman, I'm a sports person, I'm a skier and a climber.
Yeah, you need the snow, right?
I need snow, exactly. But had I said, I want to accelerate this, I want to do what I can, if I had come into it as, with an evangelical mindset, I would have started New Energy Finance to lubricate the flows of money, as we talked about, because when the money flows, we deal with it, and if the money doesn't flow, we don't. And do I wish that there was faster progress? Yeah, of course I do, but I don't think that you're going to get there by breaking capitalism. When you say a Manhattan Project, what does that mean? Does that mean nationalizing, Vestas and nationalizing the entire electrical industry, and then giving orders to Vestas to produce this many turbines, and giving orders to the newly nationalized, UK electricity? I suppose you could call it the CEGB, which used to exist, the Central Electricity Generating Board. And the problem with that is all of the weaknesses of a centrally planned economy will kill you.
Here comes the libertarian in you.
It doesn't, not really. I'm not really. I don't. I read Ayn Rand when I was in my teens, and I was libertarian for about 20 minutes and then gave up. I mean, that's not really.
And we've definitely strayed off. And that, Michael, I just want to say thank you so much for spending some time with us today and talking through this absolutely fascinating stuff. It's been terrific. I could not implore all of the listeners, if you haven't listened to Cleaning Up already, you've got to go check it out. Check out some of the show notes and the ones that we suggest. You're going to love it. And Michael, see you again soon. Thank you.
It's been a great pleasure. Thanks so much for having me here.